Aldrics Boundless Love. New York, 1917. Felicity Grant discovered a medallion concealed within a stack of old records, its surface etched with "For Valor Sergeant George Palmer," connecting her to a heroic past. Chapter 1. The Medallion's Whisper. The attic air hung thick with dust and the scent of forgotten memories. Sunlight, fractured by the grime on the single window, illuminated motes dancing in the stillness. Felicity Grant coughed, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, more against the chill of the old house than the dust itself. She'd put off this task long enough. Her grandmother, Eleanor, had passed 3 weeks prior, and the sprawling Victorian in Gramercy Park now felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Each creak of the floorboards, each rustle of unseen things, seemed to whisper of Eleanor's absence. Felicity had been tasked with sorting through the attic's accumulated debris, a lifetime of possessions reflecting Eleanor's quiet, enigmatic life. Eleanor had always been a woman of secrets, holding herself with a regal reserve that discouraged prying questions. Felicity, her only grandchild, had often wondered about the unspoken stories that lay beneath that composed surface. She ran a gloved hand over a stack of old gramophone records, their paper sleeves brittle and cracked. Most were the popular tunes of the day, foxtrots and waltzes, but one, tucked away at the bottom, was different. It had no sleeve, just the bare, black disc. As Felicity lifted it, a small, tarnished object slipped from between the record and the next, landing with a dull thud on the wooden floor. She knelt, her joints protesting slightly, and picked it up. It was a medallion, heavy in her palm. The metal, once gleaming, was now dulled with age and neglect, but the inscription was still legible, etched in a strong, clear hand, "For Valor Sergeant George Palmer." The words sent a shiver down her spine. She'd never heard of a Sergeant George Palmer. Certainly, Eleanor had never mentioned him. Felicity turned the medallion over. On the reverse, a delicate engraving depicted a single, stylized rose, its petals slightly unfurled. Beneath it, a date, July 14, 1916. The heart of the war. A war that felt both distant and immediate, its shadow still stretching across the Atlantic, touching even the relative safety of New York. America had only recently joined the fray, and the city was a whirlwind of patriotic fervor and anxious anticipation. Newspapers screamed headlines of battles won and lost, of young men marching off to glory, of families torn apart. She traced the outline of the rose with her fingertip. It was a symbol of love, of remembrance. Had George Palmer been Eleanor's lover? A brother? A friend? The questions swirled in her mind, each one more intriguing than the last. Eleanor had always been so tight-lipped about her past, deflecting any inquiries about her life before Felicity's grandfather, a man who had died long before Felicity was born. Felicity sat back on her heels, the medallion clutched tightly in her hand. The attic, with its musty smell and silent witnesses to generations past, suddenly felt less oppressive, less like a chore. It felt charged. Charged with a mystery she was determined to unravel. She spent the rest of the afternoon carefully examining the records, finding nothing else out of the ordinary. The rest of the attic yielded little more: moth-eaten clothes, dusty furniture, boxes of old letters tied with faded ribbons, the detritus of a life lived, but none of it seemed to connect to the medallion or Sergeant Palmer. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fading orange, Felicity descended the narrow attic stairs, the medallion tucked safely in her pocket. The house felt colder now, the silence deeper. She lit a gas lamp in the parlor, the flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She sat in Eleanor's favorite armchair, a worn velvet piece that still held the faint scent of her lavender perfume, and examined the medallion again. The weight of it felt significant, a tangible link to a past she was only beginning to understand. Who was Sergeant George Palmer, and what was his connection to the woman who had raised her, the woman she thought she knew? The more she turned the object over, the more certain it seemed. This wasn't the typical medal handed out, the personal touch of the rose. It was a gift, a token, a promise. A sudden thought struck her. Eleanor had kept a small, locked box in her bedroom, a box she had always refused to open in Felicity's presence. She'd said it contained private matters. Felicity had always respected her grandmother's privacy, but now, she felt a different kind of urgency, a need to know that superseded any lingering sense of propriety. Rising, she went to Eleanor's bedroom. The room was exactly as her grandmother had left it, the scent of lavender stronger here, clinging to the heavy drapes and the antique furniture. The locked box was on the top shelf of her wardrobe, tucked behind a stack of neatly folded linens. Felicity retrieved a small stepladder and climbed up, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached for the box, her fingers trembling slightly. It was heavier than she expected, made of dark, polished wood, with a small, intricate lock. She knew where Eleanor kept the key in a small porcelain dish on her dressing table, hidden beneath a pile of silk scarves. She found the key, its delicate filigree cold against her palm. It slid into the lock with a soft click. For a moment, she hesitated, a sense of unease washing over her. Was she betraying her grandmother's trust? But the image of the medallion, the inscription, the enigmatic rose, spurred her on. She lifted the lid. The inside of the box was lined with faded velvet, and nestled within were several bundles of letters, tied with silk ribbons, and a small, leather-bound diary. As she reached for the diary, a single, dried rose fell from the pages, scattering its fragile petals onto the velvet. It was the same type of rose as on the medallion. Felicity's breath caught in her throat. This was it. The answer. The beginning of the story. She just needed to find the courage to read the first words and enter a world she had only dreamed existed, hidden inside her grandmother's reserved silences. Chapter 2. Echoes of a Distant War. Felicity carried the box to the parlor, placing it carefully on the low table in front of the fireplace. The gas lamp hissed softly, casting a warm, flickering glow over the room, a stark contrast to the gathering gloom outside. The city, usually a vibrant hum of activity, felt muted tonight, the distant rumble of traffic a faint echo in the stillness. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting, anticipating. She opened the diary first. The leather was soft and worn, the pages thin and yellowed with age. The handwriting on the first page was unmistakably Eleanor's, but younger, less controlled, filled with a youthful exuberance that Felicity had never seen in her grandmother. June 12, 1916. My dearest George, the city is ablaze with excitement, though my heart is heavy with a dread I cannot name. Every young man seems to be rushing to enlist, caught up in the fever of patriotism. I try to smile, to wave my little flag, but inside, I am terrified. Terrified for you, my love, terrified for what this war will do to us all. Felicity's hand trembled. So, George was a soldier, and Eleanor had loved him. Deeply. The realization sent a wave of emotion through her sadness, yes, but also a strange sense of connection, of finally understanding a hidden piece of her grandmother's heart. She continued reading, devouring Eleanor's words, each entry a window into a past that felt both intimately familiar and shockingly foreign. Eleanor wrote of their clandestine meetings in Central Park, of stolen kisses beneath the blossoming trees, of whispered promises exchanged under the watchful gaze of the moon. She wrote of George's unwavering optimism, his belief in the righteousness of their cause, his fierce determination to do his duty. July 1st, 1916. He leaves tomorrow. My heart is breaking. I gave him the medallion today, a token of my love, a promise to wait for him, no matter how long it takes. He held it to his heart, his eyes shining with tears he refused to shed. I'll carry this with me always, Eleanor, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It will be my shield, my reminder of what I'm fighting for. Felicity reached into her pocket and touched the medallion, the cold metal a tangible link to the young lovers separated by an ocean and a war. She could almost feel the weight of their emotions, the desperation of their love, the fear that gnawed at their hopes. The diary entries chronicled the agonizing wait, the weeks that stretched into months, the news from the front that grew increasingly grim. Eleanor wrote of volunteering at a local hospital, tending to wounded soldiers, trying to find some solace in helping others, while her own heart ached with worry. October 28, 1916. Another letter arrived today, its edges stained with mud, and something darker. I dread opening them now, fearing the worst, yet I cling to them as if they were lifelines. He writes of the horrors he has seen, of the mud and the blood and the endless rain. He tries to be brave, to reassure me, but I can read between the lines. I can feel his fear, his weariness. Felicity paused, her own eyes filling with tears. She could picture Eleanor, sitting in this very room, reading those letters, her heart twisting with each word. She could imagine the constant anxiety, the gnawing uncertainty, the desperate hope that sustained her. As she continued reading, a new name began to appear in the diary entries. Arthur. At first, he was just a friend, a fellow volunteer at the hospital, someone who offered Eleanor comfort and companionship in George's absence. But gradually, the tone of the entries shifted. March 15, 1917. Arthur is so kind, so understanding. He listens to my worries, he shares my fears. He lost his brother at the Somme. He knows the pain of this war. We find solace in each other's company, a shared grief that binds us together. A knot of unease tightened in Felicity's stomach. She knew, of course, that Eleanor had eventually married someone else, Felicity's grandfather. But to read of her growing affection for another man, while George was still fighting, still hoping to return to her, it felt like a betrayal. The last entry in the diary was dated April 20th, 1917, just a few weeks before Felicity discovered the medallion. April 20th, 1917. I received a telegram today. From the War Department. George is missing in action. Presumed. I cannot even write the word. My world has shattered. Arthur is here, holding me, comforting me. He says he loves me. He wants to marry me. He says he will take care of me. I don't know what to do. My heart is torn. I promised George, but George. Maybe the entry ended abruptly. The ink smudged, as if Eleanor had been unable to continue. Felicity closed the diary, her mind reeling. The story was far more complex, far more painful than she had imagined. Eleanor had been forced to make an impossible choice, a choice between the memory of a lost love and the promise of a new life. She picked up the bundles of letters, her hands shaking. She untied the ribbon on the first bundle, recognizing George's strong, confident handwriting on the envelopes. These were the letters Eleanor had received from the front, the letters she had clung to, the letters that had sustained her hope. She began to read, immersing herself in George's words, in his descriptions of the war, his unwavering love for Eleanor, his dreams of a future that now seemed tragically impossible. A future that, for a twist of cruel fate, never came to be. And suddenly, she knew that there was a missing piece still. One that these letters, she hoped, would fill, before her heart fractured from the weight of unspoken grief that echoed from these pages. Chapter 3. The Sergeant's Unsent Letter. George's letters were a stark contrast to Eleanor's diary entries. While Eleanor's writing was filled with emotion, with the anxieties and uncertainties of a woman waiting at home, George's letters were a mixture of bravado and carefully concealed fear. He wrote of camaraderie and courage, of the bonds forged in the crucible of battle, but he also hinted at the horrors he had witnessed, the constant threat of death, the gnawing sense of futility. Somewhere in France, August 10th, 1916. My dearest Eleanor, the rain here is relentless, turning the trenches into a sea of mud. It seeps into everything, into our clothes, into our bones, into our very souls. But we endure. We have to. We are fighting for a cause greater than ourselves, for a future where you and I can walk hand in hand in Central Park without fear, without the shadow of war hanging over us. Felicity could picture him, huddled in a muddy trench, writing by the flickering light of a candle, his hands stained with dirt and gunpowder, his heart filled with longing for Eleanor. She could feel the cold, the dampness, the bone-deep weariness that permeated his words. He wrote of his fellow soldiers, of their jokes and their songs, of their shared dreams of home. He described the landscape, scarred and broken by shellfire, the air thick with the stench of death and decay. He wrote of the constant fear, the adrenaline that surged through him during battle, the numb emptiness that followed. Somewhere in France, October 15th, 1916. I saw things today, Eleanor, that I will never be able to unsee. Things that will haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. I try to be strong, to be the man you believe me to be, but sometimes, I feel like I'm drowning in this endless sea of madness. But then I think of you, of your smile, of your voice, of the promise we made, and I find the strength to carry on. Felicity's heart ached for him, for the young man caught in a war he couldn't comprehend, fighting for a future he might never see. She wondered if he had ever sensed Eleanor's growing attachment to Arthur, if he had felt the subtle shift in her letters, the unspoken distance that was growing between them. As she read through the letters, she noticed that one was different. It was thicker than the others, the envelope worn and creased, as if it had been carried around for a long time. It was addressed to Eleanor, but it had never been sent. The date on the envelope was April 18th, 1917, 2 days before Eleanor received the telegram informing her of George's disappearance. Felicity hesitated, her fingers trembling. This was a private letter, a letter George had never intended for anyone else to see. But she felt compelled to read it, to understand the full extent of his feelings, to know what he had been thinking in those final days. She carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was shaky, less confident than in his previous letters, as if he had been writing under duress. Somewhere in France, April 18th, 1917. My dearest Eleanor, I don't know if this letter will ever reach you. We are preparing for a major offensive, and the feeling in the air is grim. I have a premonition, a sense of foreboding that I cannot shake. I may not see you again. I need you to know that. These past months have been hell, Eleanor. I've seen things, done things that I never thought possible. I've lost friends, good men who deserve to live, to go home to their families. I've questioned everything I believed in, everything I was fighting for. But through it all, the one thing that has kept me going, the one thing that has given me hope, is you. You are my anchor, Eleanor, my guiding star. The thought of you, of our future together, is the only thing that keeps me sane in this insane world. I love you more than words can say. I always have and I always will. If I don't make it back, Eleanor, I want you to know that I have no regrets. I fought for what I believed in, and I loved you with all my heart. Please, don't mourn me for too long. Find happiness, Eleanor. Find someone who can give you the life I dreamed of giving you. You deserve it. But promise me one thing. Promise me that you will never forget me. Remember the love we shared, the promises we made. Remember the man I was before this war changed me. Remember me. Forever yours, George. Felicity closed the letter, tears streaming down her face. The raw emotion, the heartbreaking honesty, the selfless love, it was almost too much to bear. George had known, somehow, that he wouldn't survive. He had accepted his fate, but his only concern had been for Eleanor, for her happiness. The medallion, the rose, the promise, it all made complete, tragic sense. And now she understood the profound depth of Eleanor's silence, the weight she'd carried, the hidden grief. But there was something else in George's letter, a subtle undercurrent of resignation. It was as if he knew, even before the telegram, that Eleanor was slipping away from him. As the night deepened, a new question rose in her mind. Arthur, what part did he really play? Was he a genuine comfort or something else? Chapter 4. Shadows in the Archives. The next morning, Felicity woke with a renewed sense of purpose. George's unsent letter had clarified much, but it had also raised new questions, particularly about Arthur's role in Eleanor's life. She needed to know more, to understand the context of their relationship, to see if her growing suspicions held any truth. She decided to start with the New York Public Library. Eleanor had mentioned volunteering at a hospital, but she'd never specified which one. Felicity reasoned that if Arthur had also volunteered there might be records, newspaper articles, perhaps even photographs that could shed some light on their relationship. The library, with its soaring ceilings and hushed atmosphere, felt like a sanctuary, a place where knowledge and history were preserved and revered. She approached the reference desk, feeling a bit intimidated by the vastness of the collection. "I'm looking for information on hospitals during World War I," she explained to the librarian, a stern-looking woman with spectacles perched on her nose. "Specifically, volunteer organizations and any records of individual volunteers." The librarian directed her to the archives, a dimly lit room filled with rows of shelves stacked high with boxes and files. The air was cool and dry, the scent of old paper and ink pervasive. Felicity felt a thrill of anticipation, a sense of embarking on a real investigation. She spent hours poring over dusty records, her eyes scanning lists of names, her fingers tracing faded photographs. She found information on various hospitals in the city, on the Red Cross and other aid organizations, on the countless women who had volunteered their time and energy to support the war effort. Finally, in a box labeled Bellevue Hospital Volunteer Records, 1916-1918, she found what she was looking for. A list of volunteers, neatly typed, included both Eleanor's name, Eleanor Richards, her maiden name, and Arthur's, Arthur Hamilton. There was a small, black and white photograph attached to the list, showing a group of volunteers standing in front of the hospital. Felicity's heart skipped a beat. There was Eleanor, looking young and vibrant, her face beaming with a smile Felicity had rarely seen. And standing next to her, his arm casually draped around her shoulder, was Arthur. He was a handsome man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a kind, gentle face. But there was something in his eyes, a possessiveness, a certainty, that made Felicity uneasy. It was the way he was looking at Eleanor, the way his hand rested on her shoulder. It was more than friendly. It was intimate. And Eleanor, though smiling, seemed slightly constrained, her body angled slightly away from him. Felicity continued searching, her unease growing. She found several newspaper articles mentioning Arthur Hamilton. He was a prominent lawyer, a rising star in the city's legal circles. He was also actively involved in various war bond drives and patriotic rallies, often speaking passionately about the need to support the troops. But there was one article, buried deep in the archives, that caught her attention. It was a small piece, almost an afterthought, in a local society column. It mentioned a fundraising gala for the war effort, attended by many of the city's elite. And it included a brief mention of Arthur Hamilton, accompanied by his fiancée, a Miss Clara Winthrop. Felicity stared at the article, her mind racing. Fiancée? Arthur had been engaged to another woman while he was courting Eleanor, while George was fighting for his life in France. The betrayal felt sharp and personal, even though it had happened decades ago. She leaned back in her chair, her head spinning. The picture that was emerging was far more complicated, far more disturbing than she had anticipated. Arthur was not just a comforting friend, a shoulder for Eleanor to cry on. He was a man with his own agenda, a man who had used Eleanor's vulnerability, her grief, to his own advantage. And there was the date again connected to the engagement. Spring of 1917. The same time that the telegram about George arrived. It was too much of a coincidence. A chilling thought crept into her mind. Had Arthur known about George's disappearance before Eleanor did? Had he somehow manipulated the situation? She knew it was a far-fetched idea, bordering on paranoia, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She needed proof, something more concrete than a feeling, a suspicion. She gathered her things, her mind racing with possibilities. The library, with its hushed whispers and hidden secrets, had revealed much, but it had also deepened the mystery. She knew where she had to go next. The War Department. She needed to find out what really happened with that fateful telegram. Chapter 5. A Meeting in the Rain. The War Department office in New York was a stark, imposing building, its gray facade reflecting the somber mood of the city. The war had cast a long shadow, and even though America's involvement was relatively recent, the weight of it was palpable. The air hummed with a quiet urgency, a sense of purpose, mixed with anxiety. Felicity felt a knot of apprehension in her stomach as she approached the building. She had called ahead, requesting access to records pertaining to Sergeant George Palmer, but she had been met with bureaucratic resistance, with forms to fill out and procedures to follow. She had persisted, however, fueled by a growing sense of determination, by a need to uncover the truth. She was ushered into a small, sparsely furnished office, where a young clerk, his face pale and drawn, sat behind a large desk piled high with files. He looked up at her with weary eyes, his expression conveying a mixture of boredom and resignation. "Miss Grant," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You requested information on Sergeant George Palmer?" "Yes," Felicity replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I believe there may have been irregularities surrounding the notification of his disappearance." The clerk sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Miss Grant, we receive dozens of such requests every day. Families are understandably distraught. Records are sometimes incomplete, mistakes are occasionally made, but this is different," Felicity interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "I have reason to believe that the information provided to my grandmother, Eleanor Richards, was inaccurate. Possibly deliberately so." The clerk raised an eyebrow, a flicker of interest in his eyes. "Deliberately? That's a serious accusation, Miss Grant. Do you have any evidence to support it?" Felicity hesitated. She couldn't reveal everything she knew, not yet. She couldn't risk jeopardizing her investigation. "I have indications," she said carefully, "from personal correspondence. I believe that Sergeant Palmer may have been alive and in contact after the date he was officially declared missing." The clerk leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. "The telegram sent to Miss Richards stated that Sergeant Palmer was missing in action, presumed dead, following the offensive on April 20th, 1917. That information was based on reports from the field, on eyewitness accounts. But those reports could have been wrong," Felicity insisted, "or manipulated." The clerk was about to dismiss her. She could see it in his eyes. But then, something changed. He looked past her, towards the window, his expression shifting. "Excuse me, Miss Grant," he said, his voice suddenly softer. "There's someone here who might be able to help you." Felicity turned and saw a man standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the gray light streaming in from the window. He was tall and lean, with an air of quiet authority, his face etched with lines that spoke of experience and hardship. He wore a well-tailored suit, but there was something about him, a certain bearing, that suggested a military background. As he stepped into the room, Felicity noticed the rain. It had started to fall, a steady drizzle that coated the streets in a shimmering sheen. The sound of it, drumming against the window panes, filled the silence. "Miss Grant," the clerk said, "this is Mr. Thomas Ashton. He's a consultant with the War Department. He specializes in sensitive cases." Ashton extended his hand, his grip firm and warm. "Miss Grant," he said, his voice deep and resonant, with a hint of an accent she couldn't quite place. "I understand you have some questions about Sergeant George Palmer." Felicity met his gaze, her heart pounding. His eyes were a piercing blue, intelligent and searching, and they seemed to hold a depth of understanding that went beyond mere professional courtesy. "Yes," she replied, her voice steadier now. "I do." "Perhaps we could speak somewhere more private," Ashton suggested, glancing at the clerk, who quickly busied himself with his files. He led her out of the office and down a long corridor to a small, secluded waiting room. The room was dimly lit, furnished with a few worn armchairs and a low table. The rain continued to fall, the sound a constant backdrop to their conversation. "Please sit down, Miss Grant," Ashton said, gesturing towards one of the armchairs. He sat opposite her, his gaze unwavering. Felicity explained her story, her voice trembling with emotion as she recounted her discovery of the medallion, her reading of Eleanor's diary and George's letters, her suspicions about Arthur Hamilton. Ashton listened intently, his expression unreadable. He asked a few clarifying questions, his voice calm and measured, but he didn't interrupt her. When she had finished, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "Your grandmother's story is tragic," he said quietly. "And, unfortunately, not uncommon. War creates chaos, Miss Grant. It separates lovers, it shatters families, it leaves scars that never fully heal." "But I believe there's more to it than that," Felicity insisted. "I believe that Arthur Hamilton may have deliberately interfered, that he may have somehow influenced the information my grandmother received." Ashton nodded slowly. "It's possible," he conceded. Hamilton was a powerful man, well-connected. He was also ambitious and ruthless. Felicity's heart skipped a beat. "You know him?" "I know of him," Ashton corrected. "He was involved in some questionable activities during the war. Intelligence work, mostly. He had contacts in high places on both sides of the conflict." A chill ran down Felicity's spine. "Both sides?" Ashton met her gaze, his expression serious. "This war is not as black and white as it seems, Miss Grant. There are many shades of gray. And Arthur Hamilton operated in those shadows." He paused, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He handed it to Felicity. It was a picture of George Palmer. He was younger than in the other photos she had seen, his face unlined, his eyes full of hope and determination. But it was unmistakably him. "This was taken a few weeks before he was reported missing," Ashton said, "by one of our operatives, in a German prisoner of war camp." The image, the words, and the downpour outside combined seemed to press in on her. A German prisoner of war camp? That meant. Chapter 6. The promise of a photograph. Felicity stared at the photograph, her mind struggling to reconcile the image with everything she thought she knew. George, a prisoner of war? But the telegram Eleanor had been told he was missing, presumed dead. He was alive? She whispered, her voice barely audible above the drumming of the rain. Ashton nodded. Yes. He was captured during the offensive on April 20th. He was wounded but alive. But why wasn't Eleanor informed? Felicity asked, her voice rising in desperation. Why was she told he was dead? Ashton hesitated, his gaze shifting to the window, as if he were weighing his words carefully. That's complicated, he said. There were factors at play. Information was often delayed, sometimes deliberately withheld. And in George Palmer's case there were reasons to believe that his capture might be useful. Felicity frowned. Useful? What do you mean? Sergeant Palmer was not just an ordinary soldier, Miss Grant, Ashton explained. He had skills. He was fluent in German, for one thing. He had also received specialized training in cryptography, in code breaking. Felicity's eyes widened. He was a spy. Not in the traditional sense, Ashton said. But he was involved in gathering intelligence. He was part of a small unit that operated behind enemy lines, intercepting communications, disrupting supply lines. His capture was a significant loss. But why keep it a secret from Eleanor? Felicity persisted. She deserved to know the truth. Ashton sighed. There were concerns about security, Miss Grant. If the Germans had known the extent of Palmer's knowledge, his value as a source of information, his treatment would have been far worse. And there was also the possibility of a prisoner exchange. Negotiations were delicate. And Arthur Hamilton, was he involved in all of this? Felicity asked, her voice tight with suspicion. Ashton nodded slowly. He was. He was one of the few people who knew the truth about Palmer's capture. He was also responsible for disseminating information to the families of missing soldiers. Felicity's blood ran cold. He deliberately lied to Eleanor, she said, her voice trembling with anger. He told her George was dead, while he knew he was alive. It appears so, Ashton confirmed. But his motives are less clear. There's no concrete evidence that he acted out of malice, out of a desire to remove Palmer from the picture. But he was engaged to another woman, Felicity exclaimed. He wanted Eleanor for himself. He used her grief, her vulnerability. Ashton held up a hand. That may be true, Miss Grant. But it's also possible that he believed he was acting in the best interests of the war effort. Keeping Palmer's capture a secret, even from his loved ones, may have been seen as necessary. A sacrifice for the greater good. Felicity shook her head, unable to accept that explanation. It's not right, she said. He had no right to make that decision, to play God with their lives. Ashton looked at her, his expression filled with a mixture of sympathy and understanding. War is rarely right, Miss Grant, he said quietly. It forces people to make impossible choices, to compromise their values, to live with the consequences of their actions. He paused, then reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small, sealed envelope. He handed it to Felicity. This was found among Palmer's belongings after the war, he said. It was never delivered. It's addressed to Eleanor. Felicity took the envelope, her hands trembling. It was another unsent letter, another message from George, another piece of the puzzle. I think you should be the one to read it, Ashton said. It may provide some answers. Or, at least some closure. He stood up, signaling that their meeting was over. I'll leave you to it, he said. If you need anything further, please don't hesitate to contact me. He left the room, leaving Felicity alone with the letter, with the rain still drumming against the window panes, with the weight of the past pressing down on her. She opened the envelope carefully, her heart pounding in her chest. The paper was thin and fragile, the ink faded, but George's handwriting was unmistakable. It wasn't dated. It simply began. My dearest Eleanor, I write this knowing I may never see you again. If you ever receive it, that will at least confirm I was right. That I was taken. I have seen hope die here, Eleanor, but I haven't let mine go. It is a small, flickering candle in the darkness, but I tend it. Because of you. I will survive this, Eleanor. For you. But if that fate is denied me, and you are reading this, know this. I understand. I understand everything. And, more than my heart breaking at not seeing you, I want you to move on. Be happy. The life we'd hoped for. It isn't here. Maybe it never was. But you deserve every chance at it. Every single chance. With all my love forever, George, the photograph and the letter. Together, they formed not just a promise, but a blessing. A goodbye. Felicity felt certain of it. And she realized, with a sharp intake of breath, that Ashton had known, more than he let on. That look in his eye. He wasn't just a consultant. He was there. Chapter 7. Across the Sea of Secrets. Felicity left the War Department building feeling a mixture of grief and resolve. George's letter, though heartbreaking, had confirmed her suspicions about Arthur and solidified her understanding of Eleanor's profound sorrow. It had also hinted at a deeper story, one that involved Ashton in a way she couldn't yet grasp. His knowledge seemed too intimate, too personal, for a mere consultant. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets washed clean and glistening in the late afternoon sun. The city seemed to have regained its vibrancy, its energy, but Felicity felt detached, lost in her own thoughts. She decided to walk, to clear her head, to try to make sense of everything she had learned. She found herself drawn to the waterfront, to the vast expanse of the harbor, where ships of all sizes were coming and going, carrying goods and people, hopes and dreams, across the ocean. She watched the ferries churning their way to and from the various boroughs, the tugboats nudging massive freighters into their berths, the seagulls soaring overhead, their cries echoing across the water. The war felt both distant and immediate here, the threat of U-boats lurking beneath the surface, the constant flow of troops and supplies heading towards the battlefields of Europe. She thought of George, a prisoner of war in a faraway land, his fate uncertain, his love for Eleanor a beacon in the darkness. She thought of Eleanor, forced to make an impossible choice, to live with the consequences of a lie, to carry the burden of a secret love for the rest of her life. And she thought of Arthur, the man who had manipulated them both, who had used the war to his own advantage, who had hidden behind a facade of patriotism and respectability. As she stood there, gazing out at the water, a sudden realization struck her. Ashton had said that Arthur was involved in intelligence work, that he had contacts on both sides of the conflict. What if Arthur hadn't just been withholding information about George? What if he had been actively collaborating with the enemy? It was a shocking thought, a betrayal of unimaginable proportions. But it fit. It explained Arthur's ruthlessness, his ambition, his willingness to sacrifice anything, even love, to achieve his goals. It explained his access to information, his ability to manipulate events, his influence. She knew she needed to find proof, something concrete that would link Arthur to the enemy, something that would expose his treachery. But where to start? The war was over. Arthur was likely dead, though she had yet to confirm that, and any evidence would be buried deep, hidden beneath layers of secrecy and deception. She remembered something Ashton had said about Arthur having contacts in high places. Perhaps those contacts were still around, still guarding their secrets, still protecting Arthur's legacy. She decided to focus on Clara Winthrop, Arthur's fiancée. The society columns had mentioned her, had hinted at her family's wealth and influence. If anyone knew about Arthur's secrets, it would be her. Or perhaps her family. Felicity returned to the library, this time focusing on the society pages, on the archives of old newspapers and magazines that chronicled the lives of the city's elite. She spent hours searching, her eyes scanning columns of text, her fingers tracing faded photographs. She found numerous mentions of Clara Winthrop, of her lavish parties, her charitable work, her engagement to Arthur Hamilton. But there was nothing that suggested any involvement in espionage, any hint of scandal or intrigue. Then she found something. A small article, tucked away in a back issue of a long-defunct magazine, about a charity ball held in 1918, shortly after the war ended. The article listed the attendees, and among them was Clara Winthrop, accompanied not by Arthur Hamilton, but by a man named Heinrich Schmidt. Felicity's heart skipped a beat. Heinrich Schmidt. The name sounded German. She searched for more information on him and found several references, all linking him to the German-American community in New York. He was a wealthy businessman, a prominent figure in the city's social circles, and a known sympathizer with the German cause. She leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Clara Winthrop, Arthur's fiancée, had been seen with a German sympathizer after the war. It was a tenuous connection, perhaps, but it was enough. It was a thread that she could pull, a lead that she could follow. A new idea sparked. If Schmidt was a sympathizer, likely he knew other sympathizers. And if he knew others, maybe one of them could connect her back to the prison camp. To George. She knew she was venturing into dangerous territory, that she was dealing with powerful forces, with secrets that had been buried for decades. But she was determined to uncover the truth, to bring justice to George and Eleanor, to expose the lies that had shaped their lives. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the library floor. Felicity gathered her things, her mind already racing ahead, planning her next move. She knew the sea of secrets ran deep, and she needed to prepare to dive right in, regardless of the cost. Chapter 8. The Hospital's Hidden Ward. Felicity's investigation into Heinrich Schmidt led her down a rabbit hole of pre-war German-American societies, cultural events, and business dealings. While Schmidt himself had maintained a veneer of respectability, his associations painted a picture of someone deeply connected to a network that, at the very least, had divided loyalties during the war. She discovered he'd been under surveillance by the fledgling Bureau of Investigation, the precursor to the FBI, but the files were incomplete, heavily redacted, and ultimately inconclusive. Frustrated, Felicity decided to shift her focus back to Bellevue Hospital. She reasoned that if Arthur had been using his position there to manipulate information, there might be traces of his activities within the hospital's own records, perhaps hidden or overlooked. She returned to Bellevue, a sprawling complex of buildings that seemed to hold the city's collective pain and hope within its walls. The atmosphere was different from the library's hushed reverence here. Life and death played out in a constant, urgent drama. She managed to gain access to the hospital's archives, a musty basement room filled with rows of shelves stacked high with ledgers, patient files, and administrative documents. The archivist, a weary-looking woman named Mrs. O'Malley, seemed skeptical of Felicity's request, but eventually relented, pointing her towards a section containing records from the war years. Felicity spent days poring over the documents, her eyes scanning handwritten entries, her fingers tracing faded ink. She found records of admissions, discharges, treatments, and deaths, a stark reminder of the human cost of war. She found lists of volunteers, of doctors and nurses, of supplies and donations. She was about to give up when she noticed something odd. In a ledger detailing patient transfers, there was a section marked Special Cases Ward X. The entries were sparse, containing only patient numbers, dates, and brief notes, such as transferred from Ward A or discharged unknown destination. There were no names, no diagnoses, no details of treatment. Felicity's curiosity was piqued. Ward X? She hadn't seen any mention of a Ward X in the hospital's general records. It seemed to be secret, a hidden ward where patients were kept apart from the general population. She asked Mrs. O'Malley about it, but the archivist claimed to know nothing. Ward X? Never heard of it, she said, shaking her head. Must be a mistake. But Felicity was convinced it wasn't a mistake. She noticed that many of the special cases had been transferred from Ward A, the ward where Eleanor had volunteered. And the dates of the transfers coincided with the period when George Palmer was a prisoner of war. She returned to the ledger, her heart pounding. She carefully examined the entries, looking for any clue, any pattern that might connect Ward X to George, to Arthur, to the conspiracy she suspected. Then she found it. A single entry, dated April 25, 1917, 5 days after George was captured. Patient 1916 transferred from Ward A. Ward X note. AH authorization. Arthur Hamilton. Felicity's blood ran cold. This was it. This was the proof she had been looking for. Arthur had been involved in transferring a patient, possibly George, to a secret ward within Bellevue Hospital. But why? What was the purpose of Ward X? What had happened to the patients who were sent there? She knew she needed to find someone who had worked at Bellevue during the war, someone who might remember Ward X, someone who might know the truth. She started asking around, discreetly, among the older nurses and doctors, but she met with blank stares and evasive answers. Finally, she found an elderly cleaning lady, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been working at Bellevue for over 50 years. Mrs. Rodriguez was reluctant to talk at first, but Felicity's persistence, her genuine concern, eventually won her over. Ward X, Mrs. Rodriguez whispered, her voice trembling. That was a bad place. A place of secrets. They kept special patients there. Soldiers, mostly. Ones with mental problems. Or ones they didn't want anyone to see. Did you ever see any of the patients? Felicity asked. No. Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head. We weren't allowed near there. Only certain doctors. And Mr. Hamilton. He was always there, always giving orders. Did you ever hear anything about what they did to the patients? Mrs. Rodriguez looked around nervously, as if she were afraid of being overheard. Whispers, she said. Whispers of experiments. Of treatments that were not humane. They said it was for the war effort. To understand Shellshock. But I think it was something more. She looked directly into Felicity's eyes. There was talk of a German doctor. Working with Mr. Hamilton. In secret. The missing piece. It all came together. Felicity's intuition had been right. And now she knew she couldn't stop. She had to find out everything. But she needed to find the location of Ward X first. It was, as the cleaning lady stated, not on any official plans. Chapter 9. Whispers of Treachery. The revelation about a German doctor working with Arthur Hamilton at Bellevue's secret Ward X sent a chill down Felicity's spine. It confirmed her worst suspicions, solidifying the theory that Arthur had been actively collaborating with the enemy, using his position at the hospital to conduct unethical experiments on vulnerable soldiers, possibly including George. Finding the location of Ward X became her immediate priority. Mrs. Rodriguez had been unable to provide specifics, only that it was hidden away and not on any official plans. Felicity returned to the hospital archives, determined to find some trace of its existence, some architectural drawing, some maintenance record, anything that could point her in the right direction. She spent days searching, poring over blueprints, construction documents, and supply inventories, but she found nothing. Ward X seemed to have vanished without a trace, erased from the hospital's official history. Frustrated, she decided to try a different approach. She remembered that Eleanor had kept a detailed diary during the war, chronicling her experiences as a volunteer at Bellevue. Perhaps Eleanor had mentioned Ward X, had noticed something unusual, had inadvertently recorded a clue. She returned to Eleanor's house, to the small, locked box that held the secrets of her grandmother's past. She reread the diary entries, focusing on the period when George was a prisoner of war, when Arthur was becoming increasingly involved in Eleanor's life. She found several entries that mentioned Arthur's frequent visits to the hospital, his late-night meetings, his growing influence over the hospital's administration. But there was no direct mention of Ward X. Then she found something. A small, seemingly insignificant entry, dated April 24, 1917, the day before the patient transfer to Ward X that she had discovered in the Bellevue archives. April 24, 1917. Arthur was at the hospital late again tonight. He seemed preoccupied, agitated. He said he was working on a special project for the War Department, something that required the utmost secrecy. He asked me not to mention it to anyone. I noticed him heading towards the old storage wing, the one that's been closed for renovations. He had a key I'd never seen before. Felicity's heart skipped a beat. The old storage wing. That could be it. A disused section of the hospital, easily hidden, easily repurposed for secret activities. And Arthur had a key that Eleanor had never seen before. She immediately returned to Bellevue, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't simply ask about the old storage wing. She would be met with suspicion, with denials. She needed to find it herself, to explore it discreetly, to see if it held the answers she was seeking. She wandered through the hospital's labyrinthine corridors, pretending to be lost, her eyes searching for any sign of a disused wing, a boarded-up doorway, a section that seemed out of place. Finally, at the end of a long, dimly lit corridor, she found it. A heavy wooden door, painted the same drab green as the surrounding walls, but with no sign, no indication of what lay beyond. The door was locked, but the lock was old and rusty, and Felicity noticed that the hinges were loose, as if the door hadn't been opened in years. She waited until the corridor was deserted, then took a small hairpin from her bag, a trick she had learned from a mystery novel, and carefully worked it into the lock. She jiggled it, her hands trembling, and after a few tense moments, she heard a click. The lock was open. She pushed the door open slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The air that wafted out was cold and stale, carrying the scent of dust and decay. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her, and found herself in a long, narrow corridor, lined with closed doors. This was it. The old storage wing. And, she suspected, Ward X. She moved cautiously down the corridor, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The doors were unmarked, but she could hear faint sounds coming from behind, some of them muffled voices, the clinking of metal, the rustling of papers. She reached the end of the corridor and found a larger room, its windows boarded up, its only light source a single, flickering gas lamp hanging from the ceiling. The room was filled with old furniture, medical equipment, and boxes of supplies, all covered in a thick layer of dust. In the center of the room, she saw a table, and on the table, a stack of files. She approached cautiously, her heart pounding. She reached for the files, her fingers trembling. The top file was labeled Project Nightingale Patient Records. Felicity's blood ran cold. Project Nightingale, that was a code name, a secret designation. She opened the file, and her eyes scanned the handwritten entries. She found names, diagnoses, and details of treatments that were shocking in their brutality. Electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, experimental drugs. It was a catalog of horrors. And then, she found it. An entry, dated April 26, 1917, one day after the transfer from Ward A. Patient 1916 George Palmer diagnosis, Shellshock treatment. The entry was unfinished. The rest of the page was blank. But it was enough. It was proof that George had been a patient in Ward X, that he had been subjected to Arthur's horrific experiments. The sounds behind her made her freeze. A door opening. Footsteps. She was not alone. Chapter 10. The Dance of Deception. Felicity quickly closed the file and stepped back from the table, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The footsteps were getting closer. She looked around frantically for a place to hide, but the room offered few options. The old furniture was too bulky, the boxes too flimsy. The door at the end of the room creaked open, and a figure emerged, silhouetted against the dim light of the corridor. Felicity ducked behind a tall stack of crates, holding her breath, praying that she wouldn't be seen. The figure moved into the room, and Felicity could hear the rustling of papers, the clinking of glass. It was a man. She could tell from his silhouette, and he seemed to be searching for something. She risked a peek from behind the crates, and her blood ran cold. It was Thomas Ashton. Ashton, the consultant from the War Department. The man who had shown her George's photograph, who had given her the unsent letter. The man she had trusted. He was holding a file in his hand, and he was scanning the room, his eyes sharp and alert. He was looking for something or someone. Felicity's mind raced. What was Ashton doing here? Was he involved in the conspiracy? Was he part of Arthur's network? Or was he something else? She remembered his words, his intimate knowledge of George's situation, his claim that he knew of Arthur Hamilton. She remembered the look in his eyes, the sense of recognition, the feeling that he had been there. She realized, with a sickening certainty, that Ashton was not who he seemed to be. He was not a consultant. He was connected. Connected to George, connected to Ward X, connected to the secrets she was trying to uncover. Ashton moved closer to the table, his hand reaching for the files. Felicity knew she had to do something, to distract him, to escape before he found her. She took a deep breath and knocked over one of the crates, sending it crashing to the floor with a loud bang. Ashton whirled around, his eyes widening in surprise. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice sharp and commanding. Felicity didn't answer. She used the distraction to slip out from behind the crates and make a run for the door.
"Stop!"
Ashton shouted, his voice echoing in the room. Felicity didn't stop. She ran down the corridor, her footsteps pounding on the wooden floor, her heart racing with fear and adrenaline. She reached the door to the main hospital corridor and burst through it, slamming it shut behind her.
She didn't look back.
She ran, as fast as she could, through the maze of corridors, desperate to escape, to get away from Ashton, to put as much distance as possible between them. She finally reached the hospital entrance, and she stumbled out into the cool night air, gasping for breath. She looked around frantically, expecting to see Ashton pursuing her, but he was nowhere in sight. She hailed a passing taxi and jumped inside, giving the driver her address. As the taxi sped away, she leaned back against the seat, her body trembling, her mind reeling. She had been so close to uncovering the truth, to exposing Arthur's treachery, to finding justice for George and Eleanor. But now, she was in danger. Ashton knew she was investigating. He knew she had been to Ward X. He knew she was a threat. She realized, with a chilling certainty, that she had underestimated him. She had been naive, trusting, foolish. She had walked into a trap, a web of deception that was far more complex, far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. She had thought she was playing a game when it was not a game. She needed an ally, now more than ever. Someone who could help her before Thomas Ashton found her again. But who? Who could she trust? The answer, she hoped, lay with an old name in her grandmother's contact book. An acquaintance from the war. Someone who knew the real Thomas Ashton. Chapter 11. A stolen kiss in the dark. Felicity arrived home shaken but determined. The encounter with Ashton at Ward X had been a terrifying wake-up call, revealing the true danger she was facing. She needed help, someone with knowledge of the wartime intelligence network, someone who could shed light on Ashton's real identity and motives. She remembered a name from Eleanor's old address book, a name mentioned briefly in one of her diary entries. Captain James Sterling. Eleanor had described him as a friend of George's, a fellow officer who had served with him in the intelligence unit. Felicity reasoned that if anyone knew about Ashton, about the secrets of Ward X, it would be Sterling. Finding him, however, proved to be a challenge. The address book listed only a post office box, long since defunct. She tried contacting the War Department, but they were unhelpful, citing privacy concerns and bureaucratic red tape. She was about to give up when she remembered something Ashton had said about Arthur Hamilton having contacts in high places. Perhaps Sterling had similar connections. Perhaps he had moved in the same social circles as Arthur and Clara Winthrop. She returned to the library, to the society pages, to the archives of old newspapers and magazines. She searched for any mention of Captain James Sterling, any clue that could lead her to him. She found several references, all linking him to the city's elite, to the same social circles as Arthur and Clara. He was a frequent guest at parties and galas, a member of exclusive clubs, a known figure in the city's social scene. Then, she found something. A photograph, taken at a charity ball in 1919, shortly after the war ended. The photograph showed a group of people, and among them, standing next to Clara Winthrop, was a man identified as Captain James Sterling. And standing behind them, partially obscured by a potted palm, was Thomas Ashton. Felicity stared at the photograph, her mind racing. Ashton and Sterling, together, at the same social event, just after the war. It was more than a coincidence. It was confirmation. Confirmation that they knew each other, that they were connected, that they were part of the same network. But what was their relationship? Were they allies? Or enemies? Was Sterling involved in Arthur's conspiracy? Or was he fighting against it? She noticed something else in the photograph. Sterling was looking at Clara Winthrop, his expression attentive. And Clara was looking back at him, her eyes sparkling. There was a chemistry between them, a spark of attraction, a hint of something more. Felicity remembered the article she had found earlier, the one mentioning Clara Winthrop being seen with Heinrich Schmidt, the German sympathizer. Had Clara been playing a double game? Had she been involved with both Sterling and Schmidt? Had she been a spy? She decided to focus on Sterling. She needed to find him, to talk to him, to see if he could help her unravel the truth. She searched for more recent information on him and found that he had become a successful businessman after the war, a prominent figure in the city's financial district. She found his office address and decided to go there, to confront him directly, to see if he would be willing to talk to her. She arrived at his office building, a tall, imposing skyscraper in the heart of the financial district. She took the elevator to the top floor, her heart pounding with anticipation and nervousness. She was ushered into a spacious, luxurious office with panoramic views of the city. Sterling was sitting behind a large desk, his back to the window, silhouetted against the bright sunlight. He stood up as she entered, and Felicity was struck by his appearance. He was older than she had expected, his hair graying at the temples, his face lined with experience. But he was still handsome, still imposing, with the same air of quiet authority she had sensed in Ashton. "Miss Grant," he said, his voice deep and resonant, with a hint of a British accent. "What a pleasant surprise. To what do I owe this visit?" Felicity hesitated, unsure how to begin. She decided to be direct. "I'm investigating the disappearance of Sergeant George Palmer," she said, "and the activities of Arthur Hamilton during the war." Sterling's expression didn't change, but she noticed a flicker of something in his eyes, recognition or apprehension. "George Palmer," he said, his voice thoughtful. "A fine man. A brave soldier. I knew him well." "And Arthur Hamilton?" Felicity asked. "Hamilton," Sterling said, his voice hardening slightly. "A dangerous man. A man without scruples. He was involved in questionable activities," Felicity said. "At Bellevue Hospital. At a secret ward, Ward X." Sterling's eyes narrowed. "Ward X," he repeated, his voice low. "So, you know about that." "I know that George Palmer was a patient there," Felicity said. "And I believe that Arthur Hamilton was conducting experiments. With a German doctor." Sterling nodded slowly. "You've done your homework, Miss Grant," he said. "You've uncovered a very dark secret." He paused, then walked over to a window, gazing out at the city below. "The war changed everything," he said. "It created opportunities for men like Hamilton. Men who were willing to do anything for power, for profit." "And you were involved?" Felicity asked. Sterling turned to face her, his expression sad. He admitted. "I was part of the intelligence unit. I knew about Ward X. I knew about the experiments. I tried to stop it, but I was too late. And Thomas Ashton? Felicity asked. What is his role in all of this? Sterling's eyes widened slightly. Ashton, he said, his voice surprised. You know Ashton? He introduced himself as a consultant with the War Department, Felicity said. But I believe he's something else. Sterling smiled, a wry, knowing smile. Ashton, he said. He's always been a chameleon. He changes his identity, his appearance, his allegiance, to suit his purposes. He is the German doctor. Felicity gasped, this new revelation hitting her with surprising force. But how? Sterling walked over to the drinks cabinet. Let me tell you a story, Miss Grant. And it starts with a young man I knew very well, in the dark, under fire. His name was George Palmer. He paused and poured 2 drinks. And something that happened long before the telegram, when George and Eleanor were supposed to meet, but didn't. He handed Felicity a drink. The ice clinked in the sudden silence. He asked me to deliver a message. A medallion, actually. But I never got the chance. Because something happened that night. Something unexpected. Felicity stared at him, confused and wary. Sterling smiled. A bittersweet, haunted smile. Eleanor wasn't the only woman who could steal a kiss, in the dark, you know. He looked out across the New York skyline. It was a night just like this. Raining. I saw him,
George,
waiting for her. And I did the most foolish thing. His voice trailed off. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken words. Chapter 12. The Price of Loyalty. Felicity stared at Sterling, the implications of his words slowly sinking in. He had known George intimately. The stolen kiss, the medallion, it wasn't Eleanor he was talking about. It was him. The unspoken love, the hidden desire, the sacrifice, it all pointed to a different kind of relationship, a different kind of betrayal. You were in love with George, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sterling nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and regret. Yes, he said. I was.
Deeply.
Foolishly. Hopelessly. He took a sip of his drink, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. It was a different time, Miss Grant, he said. Such things were unspeakable. Forbidden. Especially in the military. Especially during a war. But you delivered the medallion to Eleanor? Felicity asked, trying to reconcile this new information with everything she thought she knew. No, Sterling said. I didn't. I couldn't. I was jealous. Selfish. I wanted him for myself. I thought if she didn't know he was still alive, if she believed he was dead, perhaps he would turn to me. Felicity's heart ached for him, for the young man caught in a web of forbidden love and wartime pressures. She could understand his actions, his desperation, even his betrayal. But then the offensive, Sterling continued. George was captured, and I realized the enormity of my mistake. I had let my personal feelings jeopardize his safety, his chances of survival. And Arthur Hamilton, he knew? Felicity asked. Sterling nodded. He knew. He used it against me. He threatened to expose me, to ruin my career, my life, unless I cooperated with him. Cooperated how? He wanted me to help him control the information about George's capture, Sterling explained. To keep it a secret from Eleanor, from the War Department. He said it was for the greater good, for the war effort. But I knew he had other motives. The experiments, Felicity said. He wanted to use George as a guinea pig. Sterling nodded grimly. Ashton, or Schmidt, as he was known then, was obsessed with Shellshock, with the psychological effects of war. He believed he could unlock the secrets of the human mind, could develop techniques to control soldiers, to make them more efficient, more obedient. He saw George, with his fluency in German, his intelligence training, as the perfect subject. And you allowed it? Felicity asked, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. I had no choice, Sterling said. He had me trapped. He threatened to expose my relationship with George, to ruin both of our lives. I was a coward, Miss Grant. I chose my own safety, my own reputation over George's well-being. He paused, his voice filled with remorse. But I tried to help him, in secret. I provided him with information, with supplies, with hope. I visited him at Ward X whenever I could. I tried to protect him from Ashton's experiments. But it wasn't enough. What happened to him? Felicity asked, her voice trembling. What happened to George? Sterling's eyes filled with tears.
He escaped, he said.
During a bombing raid. He managed to get out of the hospital, out of the city. He disappeared. Disappeared? Felicity repeated. But the photograph Ashton showed me, the one taken in the prisoner of war camp. Sterling shook his head. That was a fake, he said. Ashton fabricated it. To mislead you, to control you. He knew you were investigating, he knew you were getting close to the truth. He wanted to throw you off the scent. Felicity's mind reeled. Everything she thought she knew, everything she had been told, it was all a lie. A carefully constructed web of deception, designed to protect Arthur Hamilton, to conceal his crimes, to silence anyone who threatened to expose him. And Ashton, he was the mastermind. The German doctor, the spy, the manipulator. He had been playing her all along, using her to what? To find George? To silence Sterling? To protect his own secrets? She realized, with a chilling certainty, that she was still in danger. Ashton was still out there, still pulling the strings, still controlling the narrative. And now, he knew she was onto him. I need to find George, she said, her voice filled with a renewed sense of determination. I need to find him before Ashton does. Sterling looked at her, his expression hopeful. Perhaps it's not too late, he said. Perhaps he's still alive. He paused and took a card from his wallet. There's a place. A small town. Upstate. He mentioned it once.
Said it was
safe. A place no one would find him. Felicity took the card, hope flickering in her chest. A destination. A new lead. Sterling looked at her and took her hand. Be careful, Miss Grant. Ashton is a dangerous man. And he will stop at nothing to protect his lies. Felicity nodded and looked down at her hand in his. A moment of warmth, of connection, of shared grief and resolve. He took something from George. Something important. Something to remind him. Sterling's voice drifted off. The rose? Felicity asked, knowing instantly. Sterling nodded. He always kept it. Said it was a reminder of the good that existed, that he needed to believe in. He squeezed her hand.
Go.
And be careful. Felicity left the office with renewed purpose. But she knew now the stakes were even higher. Chapter 13. Letters from the front. Armed with the name of the town Sterling had provided Oakhaven, Felicity felt a flicker of hope amidst the darkness of the conspiracy she was unraveling. She decided to take a train upstate the following morning, leaving the suffocating secrets of the city behind, if only for a little while. Before she left, however, she felt compelled to revisit Eleanor's house, to re-examine the letters and the diary, now with the knowledge of Sterling's relationship with George and Ashton's true identity. She needed to see if there were any clues, any hints that she had missed before, anything that could shed light on George's possible escape route or his state of mind after leaving Ward X. She sat in Eleanor's parlor, the familiar scent of lavender a bittersweet reminder of the woman who had lived with so much unspoken grief. She opened the small, locked box and carefully unfolded George's unsent letters, the ones she had read before, the ones that had spoken of his love for Eleanor, his hopes for a future that had been stolen from him. She reread them, searching for any mention of Oakhaven, any reference to a safe place, any clue that could help her find him. But there was nothing. The letters were filled with his longing for Eleanor, his descriptions of the war, his growing disillusionment, but they offered no concrete leads. Then, she turned to Eleanor's diary. She reread the entries from the period after George's disappearance, the entries that chronicled her grief, her confusion, her growing relationship with Arthur Hamilton. She searched for any mention of George, any hint that he might have contacted her, that he might have tried to reach out to her. She found several entries that described Eleanor's nightmares, her recurring dreams of George, her sense of unease, her feeling that he was still alive, somewhere. But there was nothing concrete, nothing that suggested he had actually contacted her. Then she found something, a small, seemingly insignificant entry, dated June 10th, 1918, several months after George's escape from Ward X. June 10, 1918. I received a strange letter today. It was anonymous. No return address. Just a single sheet of paper with a few typewritten words. He lives. He remembers. He hopes. I don't know what to make of it. Is it a cruel joke? Or could it be a message from George? Felicity's heart skipped a beat. An anonymous letter. He lives. He remembers. He hopes. It was a message of hope, a message of reassurance, a message from George. She examined the entry more closely. Eleanor had described the letter as typewritten. That was significant. George had always written his letters by hand, his handwriting strong and distinctive. But after his escape from Ward X, after the experiments, after the trauma, perhaps he had been unable to write. Perhaps he had used a typewriter to conceal his identity, to protect himself. She searched the box for the letter itself, but it was gone. Eleanor must have kept it, treasured it, perhaps even destroyed it, to protect George, to keep his secret safe. But the fact that the letter had existed, that Eleanor had received it, it was proof. Proof that George had survived, that he had escaped, that he had tried to reach out to her. And the words he remembers. He hopes. They suggested that George still held onto his memories of Eleanor, that he still cherished the hope of a future with her, a future that had been so cruelly denied to them. Felicity closed the diary, her mind racing. The anonymous letter was a crucial piece of the puzzle. It confirmed that George was alive, that he was aware of Eleanor's situation, that he was waiting. But where was he waiting? And how could she find him? She remembered the town Sterling had mentioned, Oakhaven. A small town, upstate, a place where George had said he would be safe, a place where no one would find him. It was a long shot, perhaps, but it was the only lead she had. She decided to go to Oakhaven, to search for any trace of George, any sign that he had been there, that he might still be there. She packed a small bag, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She knew she was venturing into the unknown, that she was facing dangers she couldn't fully comprehend. But she was determined to find George, to bring him back to Eleanor, to reunite the lovers who had been separated by war, by betrayal, by a web of lies that had stretched across decades. She looked at Eleanor's photo one last time, and she felt, for the first time in this journey, that she was truly doing it for her. As the train pulled away from Grand Central, leaving the skyline behind, she clutched the card with the town's name. It was a faint hope, but it was all she had. Chapter 14. The Unveiling of Truth. The train journey to Oakhaven was long and uneventful, the landscape gradually shifting from the urban sprawl of New York City to the rolling hills and verdant forests of upstate New York. Felicity used the time to reflect on everything she had learned, to piece together the fragments of the puzzle, to prepare herself for what she might find in Oakhaven. She arrived in the late afternoon, the town bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. Oakhaven was a small, picturesque village, nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains. It felt peaceful, remote, a world away from the bustling city she had left behind. She checked into a small, family-run inn, the only one in town. The innkeeper, a friendly, middle-aged woman named Mrs. Abernathy, seemed surprised to see a visitor, especially one from the city. Oakhaven doesn't get many tourists, she said, as she handed Felicity the key to her room. Mostly just folks passing through. What brings you here? Felicity hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. I'm researching my family history, she said, choosing her words carefully. I believe a relative of mine may have lived here many years ago.
Oh?
What's their name? Mrs. Abernathy asked, her curiosity piqued. George Palmer, Felicity said. Sergeant George Palmer. He was a soldier during the war. Mrs. Abernathy's expression changed, a flicker of recognition or apprehension. She looked away, her gaze shifting to the window. Palmer, she repeated, her voice thoughtful. That name, it rings a bell. But it's been a long time. He might have used a different name, Felicity said. He was in hiding. He was trying to escape his past. Mrs. Abernathy nodded slowly. There was a man years ago, she said. He lived here for a while. He was quiet, kept to himself. We called him Mr. Smith. Felicity's heart skipped a beat. Mr. Smith. A common alias, a name that could conceal anyone, a name that could be George. Do you remember anything about him? Felicity asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. He was a kind man, Mrs. Abernathy said. He helped out around the town.
He was good with his hands.
He fixed things for people. He was a carpenter. A carpenter. Felicity remembered Sterling's words about George being good with his hands. It was another connection, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Do you know where he lived? Felicity asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Abernathy pointed towards the window, towards a small, white cottage on the edge of town, nestled among a grove of oak trees.
He lived there, she said.
The old Miller place. It's been empty for years. No one's lived there since he left. Left? Felicity repeated. He's not here anymore? Mrs. Abernathy shook her head.
No, she said.
He disappeared. One day he was just gone. No one knew where he went. No one ever saw him again. Felicity's heart sank. Disappeared. Again. It was the same story, the same pattern, the same mystery. But there must be something, she said, her voice filled with desperation. Some clue, some trace, something he left behind. Mrs. Abernathy hesitated, then reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small, wooden box. She handed it to Felicity. He left this, she said. He asked me to keep it safe. He said if anyone ever came looking for him, I should give it to them. Felicity took the box, her hands trembling. It was a simple, unadorned box, made of dark wood, with a small, brass latch. She opened it carefully, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single object. A dried rose. Felicity gasped. The rose. The same type of rose as on the medallion, the same type of rose that had fallen from Eleanor's diary. It was a symbol of their love, a reminder of their promise, a testament to their enduring connection. And tucked beneath the rose, there was a small, folded piece of paper. Felicity unfolded it carefully, her fingers trembling. It was a letter from George. My dearest Felicity, if you are reading this, it means that you have found your way to me. It means that you have uncovered the truth. It means that Eleanor is gone. I knew, somehow. I felt it. A part of me died with her. The hope that I had clung to for so many years had vanished. I have lived a long life, Felicity. A life filled with regret, with guilt, with unspoken love. I made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. I hurt the people I loved most. I let fear control me. But I never forgot Eleanor. I never stopped loving her. I carried her memory with me, always. It was the only thing that kept me going. I know I can never make amends for what I did. I know I can never ask for her forgiveness. But I hope that she knew. I hope that she understood. I hope that she found some happiness. I am leaving this world, Felicity. I am tired. I am ready to rest. But I want you to know that I am at peace. I have found solace in the memories of a love that transcended time and space and even death. Tell her, I loved her. Always.
George.
Felicity closed the letter, tears streaming down her face. The truth finally unveiled. George had lived. He had escaped. He had found a measure of peace in Oakhaven. But he had never been able to return to Eleanor, never been able to reunite with the woman he loved. The weight of their story, their tragedy, their enduring love, it was almost too much to bear. But there was one more thing. A small, almost unnoticeable postscript at the very bottom. P.S. Tell Sterling I forgive him. The weight and the peace in those words resonated like a strike to her very core. Chapter 15. Scars of the Heart. Felicity left Oakhaven with a heavy heart, George's letter clutched tightly in her hand. The discovery of his life and his death in the quiet village had brought a sense of closure, but it had also opened up new wounds, new layers of grief and regret. She knew she had to return to New York, to confront Ashton, to deliver George's message of forgiveness to Sterling, to finally bring an end to the decades-long conspiracy that had shaped so many lives. The train journey back was a blur, her mind racing with thoughts of George and Eleanor, of Sterling and Ashton, of the choices they had made, the sacrifices they had endured, the love that had been lost and found and lost again. She arrived in New York late at night, the city lights a stark contrast to the peaceful darkness of Oakhaven. She went straight to Sterling's office building, hoping to find him there, even at that late hour. The building was deserted, the lobby dark and silent. She took the elevator to the top floor, her heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and determination. She found Sterling's office door unlocked, and she stepped inside, cautiously. The office was dimly lit, a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. Sterling was sitting at his desk, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. He looked up as she entered, his eyes red-rimmed, his face pale and drawn. He looked defeated. "Miss Grant," he said, his voice hoarse. "You found him?" Felicity nodded, her own eyes filling with tears. "Yes," she said. "I found him.
He was in Oakhaven.
He lived there for many years. He died recently." Sterling closed his eyes, his body slumping in his chair. "I knew it," he whispered. "I felt it. I failed him." Felicity walked over to his desk and placed George's letter in front of him.
"He wrote this," she said.
"For you." Sterling looked at the letter, his hands trembling. He picked it up and unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the handwritten words. As he read, his expression changed, a flicker of hope replacing the despair. He finished reading, and he looked up at Felicity, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and relief. He forgave me," he whispered. He understood." Felicity nodded. "He did," she said. "He knew about your feelings for him. He knew about the sacrifices you made. He knew everything." Sterling leaned back in his chair, his body relaxing, the tension draining from his face. "Thank you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for bringing me this. For giving me peace." Felicity smiled sadly. "It was George's peace to give," she said. "Not mine." She paused, then took a deep breath. "There's something else," she said. "Something you need to know. About Ashton." Sterling looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "Ashton?" he repeated. "What about him?" "He's not who he says he is," Felicity said. "He's Schmidt, the German doctor. The one who conducted the experiments at Ward X." Sterling's face hardened, his eyes flashing with anger. "I knew it," he said. "I suspected it, but I couldn't prove it. He was always one step ahead. He was a master of deception." "He's still out there," Felicity said. "He knows I'm onto him." "He's dangerous." Sterling nodded grimly. "He is," he said. "He's ruthless. He'll stop at nothing to protect his secrets." "We need to stop him," Felicity said. "We need to expose him. We need to bring him to justice." Sterling looked at her, his expression determined. "We will," he said. "Together. We owe it to George. We owe it to Eleanor. We owe it to ourselves." He stood up, his body straightening, his eyes filled with a renewed sense of purpose. "I have connections," he said. "People I can trust. People who can help us. We'll find him, and we'll make him pay." Felicity nodded, feeling a surge of hope, of strength, of resolve. She had come to New York seeking answers, seeking justice, seeking closure. And now, she was closer than ever to achieving all three. But she knew the final confrontation with Ashton would be dangerous, that he would not go down without a fight, that he would use all his cunning, all his deception, all his power to protect himself. She looked at Sterling, and she saw a reflection of her own determination, her own courage, her own hope. They were united, now, by a shared grief, a shared purpose, a shared love for George. They knew the final confrontation was coming. Soon. They looked at one another in silence. And the scars of the heart, while still present, suddenly felt a little less deep. Chapter 16. The Rendezvous Point. Sterling's connections proved invaluable. Within hours, he had mobilized a network of contacts, former intelligence officers, government officials, influential businessmen, all of whom had reasons to want Ashton Schmidt brought to justice. They provided information, resources, and manpower, creating a formidable force to counter Ashton's cunning and ruthlessness. They discovered that Ashton had been living under an assumed identity for decades, using a complex web of shell corporations and offshore accounts to conceal his wealth and his activities. He had maintained his connections to the intelligence community, using his expertise in psychology and manipulation to influence events, to control information, to protect his secrets. They tracked him to a secluded estate on Long Island, a sprawling property overlooking the ocean. The estate was heavily guarded, equipped with state-of-the-art security systems, and staffed by a team of loyal, well-trained personnel. It was a fortress, designed to protect Ashton from any threat, to keep him hidden from the world. Sterling and Felicity knew that a direct assault on the estate would be too risky, too dangerous. They needed a plan, a strategy, a way to lure Ashton out, to confront him on their terms, to expose him without endangering themselves or others. They decided to use Felicity as bait. They knew that Ashton was obsessed with her, that he saw her as a threat, that he wanted to silence her. They reasoned that if they could make him believe she had uncovered something crucial, something that could expose him, he would come after her. He would reveal himself. They crafted a plan, a carefully orchestrated deception, designed to play on Ashton's ego, his paranoia, his desire for control. They leaked information through their contacts, suggesting that Felicity had found evidence linking Ashton to the German government, to espionage activities during the war, to the experiments at Warromance. They planted false clues, fabricated documents, created a trail of evidence that led directly to Ashton, to his real identity, to his crimes. They made it seem as if Felicity was about to expose him, to reveal his secrets to the world. They chose a rendezvous point, a public location where they could confront Ashton, where they could have the advantage, where they could control the situation. They chose the New York Public Library, the place where Felicity's investigation had begun, the place where she had first uncovered the secrets of Warromance. They set the date and time, and they waited. Felicity was nervous, terrified, but also determined. She knew the risks, she knew the danger, but she was willing to face it, to bring an end to Ashton's reign of terror, to finally find justice for George and Eleanor. She arrived at the library early, her heart pounding in her chest. She went to the archives, to the same room where she had spent so many hours poring over dusty records, searching for clues, unraveling the truth. She waited. The minutes ticked by, slowly, agonizingly. The library was quiet, hushed, the only sound the rustling of papers, the occasional cough, the distant hum of the city. Then she saw him, Ashton. He was standing at the entrance to the archives, his eyes scanning the room, his expression cold, calculating, menacing. He was dressed impeccably, as always, but there was something different about him, something unhinged. He saw her, and he smiled, a cruel, knowing smile. He walked towards her, his footsteps echoing in the silence. "Miss Grant," he said, his voice smooth, silky, but with an underlying edge of threat. "We meet again." Felicity stood her ground, her body trembling, but her voice firm. "Ashton," she said. "Or should I call you Schmidt?" His smile vanished, his eyes narrowing. "You know," he said, his voice low, "dangerous. You know too much." "I know everything," Felicity said. "I know about Warromance. I know about the experiments. I know about George." Ashton's face contorted in anger, his mask of civility slipping, revealing the monster beneath. "You should have stayed out of it," he said, his voice hissing. "You should have minded your own business." "It is my business," Felicity said. "George was my family. Eleanor was my family. You destroyed them." Ashton took a step closer, his hand reaching inside his coat. "I did what I had to do," he said. "For the greater good. For science. For progress." "You're a liar," Felicity said. "You're a murderer. You're a traitor." Ashton laughed. A cold, chilling laugh. "You can't prove anything," he said. "You have nothing."
"I'm untouchable."
At that moment, Sterling stepped out from behind a bookshelf, his gun drawn, his expression grim. "I wouldn't be so sure about that, Ashton," he said. Ashton whirled around, his eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing in fury. "Sterling," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. You betrayed me. I betrayed you? Sterling said, his voice filled with anger. You betrayed everyone. You betrayed your country. You betrayed your friends. You betrayed George. Ashton's hand moved towards his gun, but Sterling was faster. He fired, the shot echoing through the library, shattering the silence. Ashton staggered back, his hand clutching his chest, his eyes wide with shock and pain. He crumpled to the floor, his body lifeless. The confrontation was over. Felicity stared at Ashton's body, her mind numb, her body trembling. It was over. Finally over. The decades-long conspiracy, the web of lies, the secrets, the betrayals, it had all come to an end.
But the cost had been high.
Sterling walked over to her, his face etched with sadness and relief. It's over, he said, his voice gentle.
He's gone.
Felicity nodded, tears streaming down her face. It's over, she repeated. But it will never be forgotten. The police sirens wailed, approaching in the distance. But for now, there was stillness. And truth. Chapter 17. Flight from the Past. The aftermath of Ashton's death was a whirlwind of police investigations, media scrutiny, and legal proceedings. Sterling's connections helped to smooth the process, to ensure that the truth was revealed, that Ashton's crimes were exposed, that justice, however delayed, was finally served. Felicity cooperated fully with the authorities, providing them with all the evidence she had gathered, sharing her knowledge of Ward X, of Arthur Hamilton's conspiracy, of George's tragic fate. She testified at hearings, answered endless questions, relived the trauma of her investigation, but she did it all with a quiet determination, a sense of duty to the people whose lives had been shattered by Ashton's actions. Sterling stood by her side throughout the ordeal, providing support, guidance, and a shared sense of grief and resolution. They had forged a bond, a connection born of their shared love for George, their shared quest for justice, their shared past. The media coverage was intense, sensationalized, but Felicity tried to ignore it, to focus on the task at hand, to ensure that George and Eleanor's story was told truthfully, respectfully, with dignity. She refused to let their lives be reduced to a tabloid headline, to a footnote in history. As the legal proceedings wound down, Felicity felt a growing sense of emptiness, of loss. The investigation had consumed her, had given her purpose, had driven her forward. But now it was over. And she was left with what? She realized that she needed to escape, to get away from the city, from the memories, from the pain. She needed to find a place where she could heal, where she could grieve, where she could rebuild her life. She decided to return to Oakhaven, to the quiet village where George had found solace, where he had lived out his final years, where he had left his last message. She wanted to be close to him, to feel his presence, to honor his memory. She packed her bags, said goodbye to Sterling, and took the train upstate, leaving the city behind, once again. She arrived in Oakhaven on a crisp autumn day, the leaves turning golden and red, the air filled with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. She went straight to the old Miller place, the cottage where George had lived, the place where he had found peace. The cottage was empty, still, but it felt different. It felt alive. Felicity could sense George's presence, his spirit, his love. She walked through the rooms, touching the walls, the furniture, the objects he had touched, the things he had made. She found a small, wooden chest in the corner of the bedroom, and she opened it carefully. Inside, she found a collection of tools, woodworking tools, the tools George had used to create, to build, to heal. She picked up a chisel, its handle worn smooth from years of use, its blade still sharp. She could almost feel George's hand on hers, guiding her, teaching her, sharing his passion. She decided to stay in Oakhaven, to live in the cottage, to continue George's work. She started small, fixing things around the house, repairing furniture, building small objects. She found solace in the work, in the rhythm of the tools, in the creation. She gradually became part of the community, helping her neighbors, sharing her skills, making friends. She found a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, a sense of home. She visited George's grave, in the small village cemetery, regularly. She brought him flowers, she talked to him, she shared her life with him. She told him about her work, about her friends, about her healing. She knew that she would never forget George or Eleanor or Sterling or the journey she had taken to uncover their secrets, to bring them justice, to find her own peace. She knew that the scars of the past would always be there, but they were fading, softening, becoming part of her story, part of her strength. One evening, looking at the sunset and the mountains, Felicity realized she was no longer fleeing the past. She was embracing the future, a future that, unexpectedly, felt bright. Chapter 18. The Edge of No Man's Land. Felicity's life in Oakhaven settled into a quiet rhythm. The woodworking became more than just a hobby, it was a therapy, a connection to George, a way to build something tangible and beautiful out of the wreckage of the past. She started taking on small commissions from the villagers, repairing furniture, crafting toys, even building a new porch for Mrs. Abernathy at the inn. One day, a letter arrived. It was from Sterling. He wrote of the ongoing investigations into Ashton's network, the dismantling of his empire, the slow, grinding wheels of justice. He also wrote of his own life, his own healing, his own attempts to make amends for the past. He mentioned visiting Eleanor's grave, placing a single rose on her headstone, a silent apology, a final goodbye. He ended the letter with an invitation. He was planning a trip to Europe, to France, to the battlefields where George had fought, where he had been captured, where so many had died. He asked Felicity to join him. Felicity hesitated. The thought of returning to the source of so much pain, to the place where George's life had been irrevocably altered, was daunting. But she also felt a pull, a need to understand, to witness, to honor George's sacrifice. She wrote back to Sterling, accepting his invitation. They met in Paris, a city still bearing the scars of war, but also vibrant, alive, rebuilding. They spent a few days exploring the city, visiting museums, walking along the Seine, trying to find some lightness, some beauty, amidst the shadows of the past. Then, they traveled to the Somme, to the heart of the battlefields, to the place where George had fought, where he had been captured, where he had lost his innocence. The landscape was haunting. Rolling hills, now green and peaceful, but still bearing the marks of the trenches, the craters, the destruction. Felicity could almost hear the echoes of the guns, the screams of the men, the silence of death. They visited the war cemeteries, vast fields of white crosses, stretching as far as the eye could see. Each cross a life lost, a story untold, a tragedy. Felicity felt overwhelmed by the scale of the loss, by the futility of war. Sterling led her to a specific section of the cemetery, a section reserved for soldiers who had been reported missing, presumed dead. He stopped in front of a particular cross, its inscription simple, stark, Sergeant George Palmer missing in action April 20th, 1917. Felicity stared at the cross, her eyes filling with tears. This was a lie. George hadn't died here. He had survived. He had escaped. He had lived another life. But this cross, this represented the official story, the deception, the betrayal. Sterling placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle, supportive. He wasn't here, he said, his voice soft. He wasn't lost here. They walked along the old trench lines, now overgrown with grass and wildflowers, but still visible, still scarring the landscape. Sterling pointed out the different positions, the German lines, the British lines, the no man's land in between. This is where it happened, he said, his voice trembling. This is where he was captured. Felicity could almost see it, could almost feel it, the chaos, the fear, the desperation. She could imagine George, fighting bravely, desperately, until he was overwhelmed, captured, taken away. They stood there, in silence, for a long time, the wind whispering through the grass, the sun setting over the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields. Felicity felt a sense of closure, of understanding. She had come to this place, this edge of no man's land, to confront the past, to honor George's memory, to find some peace. And she had. She knew that the scars of war would always be there, that the pain of loss would never fully disappear, but she also knew that life went on, that hope endured, that love could transcend even the most horrific of circumstances. She turned towards Sterling.
"Thank you," she said.
Sterling smiled, a tired and knowing smile. "He would have liked you," Sterling stated, looking across the field. And at that moment, Felicity knew that the past was not a burden, but a foundation. She felt it, there, on the scarred earth, a new beginning. Chapter 19. Reunion in the Ruins. After their visit to the Somme, Felicity and Sterling returned to Paris, a sense of shared grief and quiet understanding bonding them. The trip had been emotionally draining, but it had also been cathartic, a necessary pilgrimage to the heart of George's wartime experience. Before separating, Sterling suggested they visit a small church on the outskirts of Paris, a place he had discovered during his previous travels. He said it had been used as a makeshift hospital during the war, a place where many wounded soldiers, both Allied and German, had been treated. Felicity agreed, curious to see another site connected to the war, another place where lives had been touched, changed, or lost. The church was old, its stone walls weathered and worn, its stained glass windows depicting scenes of faith and hope. It stood in a quiet, secluded area, surrounded by trees and gardens, a peaceful oasis amidst the bustling city. As they entered the church, Felicity was struck by its silence, its serenity. The air was cool and still, the only sound the gentle echo of their footsteps. They walked slowly down the aisle, admiring the architecture, the artwork, the history. Sterling pointed out the areas where the makeshift hospital beds had been set up, the places where the doctors and nurses had worked tirelessly, the scars of war that were still visible on the walls. They reached the altar, and Felicity noticed a small, wooden box on a nearby table. It was similar to the box George had left for her in Oakhaven, the box that had contained the dried rose and his final letter. She approached the table, her heart pounding. She reached for the box, her fingers trembling. She opened it carefully. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single object. A medallion. Felicity gasped. It was George's medallion, the one Eleanor had given him, the one he had promised to carry with him always, the one Sterling had failed to deliver. She picked it up, her hands shaking. It was tarnished, worn, but the inscription was still legible, "For Valor, Sergeant George Palmer." And on the reverse, the single, stylized rose, its petals slightly unfurled. She turned to Sterling, her eyes wide with disbelief. How did this get here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper.
Sterling smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "George," he said.
"He left it here. He must have come here after his escape. He must have known it would be safe here." Felicity's mind raced. George had been here, in this church, after his escape from Ward X. He had left the medallion, his most treasured possession, his symbol of love, his connection to Eleanor.
But why?
Why here? Why not try to return to Eleanor? Why not contact her? She realized, with a sudden clarity, that George had made a choice. He had chosen to let Eleanor go. He had chosen to protect her, to spare her the pain of his trauma, his changed self. He had chosen to sacrifice his own happiness for hers. And he had left the medallion here, in this church, as a message, a sign, a hope that one day someone would find it, someone would understand, someone would bring it back to Eleanor. And that someone was her. Felicity clutched the medallion tightly in her hand, tears streaming down her face. She had found it. She had found the final piece of the puzzle, the ultimate proof of George's love, his sacrifice, his enduring spirit. She looked at Sterling, and she saw a reflection of her own grief, her own relief, her own understanding. They had both loved George in different ways, and they had both lost him. But they had also found him, again, in this quiet church, in this sacred space. They stood there in silence for a long time, the medallion a tangible link between them, between the past and the present, between love and loss. Felicity knew then she was ready to go home, to bring the medallion and the news to her grandmother's resting place. It was time. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Fates. Felicity returned to New York with the medallion, a tangible symbol of George's love and sacrifice, a final piece of the puzzle that had consumed her for so long. She felt a sense of closure, of completion, but also a profound sadness, a lingering grief for the lives that had been shattered, the love that had been lost, the tragedy of war. She went first to Eleanor's house, to the place where her journey had begun, to the place where she had first discovered the secret of the medallion, the hidden story of George and Eleanor's love. She walked through the rooms, touching the furniture, the objects, the memories. She could almost feel Eleanor's presence, her spirit, her love. She went to the attic, to the spot where she had found the medallion, the place where the mystery had unfolded. She sat on the floor, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, and she held the medallion in her hand, feeling its weight, its significance, its power. She then went to Eleanor's grave, in a quiet cemetery on the outskirts of the city. She stood before the headstone, her eyes filling with tears. She placed the medallion on the grave, next to the single rose that Sterling had left there, a silent tribute, a final goodbye. "I found him, Grandma," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I found him, and I found his medallion. He loved you. Always. He never forgot you." She spent a long time at the graveside, talking to Eleanor, sharing her story, her journey, her discoveries. She told her about George's life in Oakhaven, about his letter, about his peace. She told her about Sterling, about Ashton, about the conspiracy that had separated them. She felt a sense of release, of healing. She had fulfilled her promise. She had uncovered the truth. She had brought George and Eleanor back together, in a way, in spirit, in memory. She knew that she would never forget their story, that she would carry it with her, always, as a reminder of the power of love, the tragedy of war, the importance of truth. She left the cemetery, feeling lighter, stronger, more at peace. She had faced the past, she had confronted the shadows, she had found her way through the darkness. She returned to Oakhaven, to the cottage where George had lived, to the place where she had found her own solace, her own purpose, her own home. She continued her woodworking, creating beautiful objects, sharing her skills, building a life for herself, a life that honored George's memory, a life that celebrated love and hope and resilience. She and Sterling remained in contact, writing letters, sharing their thoughts, their feelings, their healing. They had forged a bond, a connection that transcended time and space, a friendship born of shared grief, shared purpose, shared love. Felicity looked around the small cottage. The tools, the wood, the unfinished projects. It was a new life, a different life, but it was hers. And it was good. The sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, just like in the attic where it all began. But this time, the light felt warm, hopeful, full of promise. The reckoning of fates had been harsh, but it had also been just. And in the quiet aftermath, Felicity found not an ending, but a beginning. A new chapter, written with her own hands, built on the foundation of a love story that had endured the ravages of war, the test of time, and the silence of secrets. She picked up a piece of wood and began to carve. Epilogue. Years passed. Felicity became a fixture in Oakhaven, known for her quiet strength, her gentle kindness, and her exquisite woodworking. The cottage, once filled with the echoes of George's solitary life, now resonated with the sounds of laughter, friendship, and the steady rhythm of her craft. She never married, but she was not alone. She had built a community, a chosen family, a life filled with purpose and connection. Sterling visited occasionally, their meetings marked by a shared understanding, a quiet camaraderie that needed no words. They would sit on the porch, overlooking the valley, talking about their lives, their work, their memories. They would visit George's grave together, placing fresh flowers, sharing a silent moment of remembrance. The story of George and Eleanor, of Arthur Hamilton's treachery, of Wardex, became a local legend, a cautionary tale, a testament to the enduring power of love and the devastating consequences of war. Felicity never spoke of it publicly, but She shared it with those she trusted, with those who understood, with those who needed to know. One spring morning, Felicity was working in her garden, planting roses, the same type of rose that had been engraved on George's medallion, the same type of rose that had symbolized their love. She was older now, her hair streaked with silver, her hands weathered and worn, but her eyes still held the same spark of determination, the same hope. She heard a car approaching, and she looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. A young woman got out of the car, a stranger, but with a familiar look. The young woman walked towards her, her eyes scanning the cottage, the garden, the surroundings. She stopped in front of Felicity, her expression curious, hesitant. "Excuse me," the young woman said. "Are you Felicity Grant?" Felicity nodded. "Yes," she said. "I am." "My name is Sarah," the young woman said. "Sarah Winthrop. I believe we're related." Felicity's heart skipped a beat. Winthrop. Clara Winthrop's family. The family that had been intertwined with Arthur Hamilton's. The family that had played a part in the conspiracy. "I'm researching my family history," Sarah said. "And I found some letters. Some old documents. They mentioned your name. And a story. A story about a soldier named George Palmer."
Felicity smiled. A sad, knowing smile.
The past, it seemed, was never truly buried. It always found a way to resurface, to reconnect, to remind. "Come in, Sarah," Felicity said, her voice gentle. "I have a story to tell you." She led Sarah into the cottage, to the place where it all began, to the place where she had uncovered the secrets of the past, to the place where she had found her own future. She showed Sarah the medallion, George's letter, the photographs, the evidence. She told her the story, the whole story, from beginning to end. Sarah listened, her eyes wide with disbelief, with sadness, with understanding. She learned about her family's involvement in the conspiracy, about Arthur Hamilton's treachery, about George and Eleanor's tragic love. She also learned about Felicity's courage, her determination, her resilience. She learned about the power of truth, the importance of justice, the enduring strength of the human spirit. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the valley, Sarah stood up to leave. She turned to Felicity, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for telling me this, for sharing this with me, for bringing their story to light." Felicity nodded. "It was a story that needed to be told," she said. "A story that needed to be remembered."
Sarah smiled, a sad, grateful smile.
"I will remember," she said. "I promise." And as Sarah drove away, Felicity stood on the porch, watching her go, feeling a sense of peace, of completion, of hope. The circle was complete. The story had been told. The truth had been revealed. And love, in its many forms, had endured. Felicity turned and went back inside the cottage, to the warmth of the fire, to the scent of wood shavings, to the quiet rhythm of her life. She picked up a piece of wood, a beautiful piece of cherry, and she began to carve. A rose. A single, perfect rose.